Okay, it's almost 7 o'clock. At least where I live, it's 7 o'clock. So we will get going here in a second. We're getting people let in to this meeting, and then we will get going. It's been a good week. The weather's been warm. Our nights have hardly been freezing at night, which is odd for our climate because we're at a high altitude in the foothills of the mountains. Plants are starting to grow, so it's pretty exciting. I don't know if that means it's going to be an early spring or not. It probably won't be, but it's certainly warm right now. So that's pretty fun. I'm getting excited about stuff. Thursdays are good days because we have this class on Thursdays. That's the best thing about Thursdays. But last Thursday, I became a grandpa. I'm too young to be a grandpa. And this Thursday, meaning today, Enoch got his mission call. So Thursdays are a good day. That's pretty exciting. So we're just letting everybody into this meeting here.
Where did he get called to?
Enoch got called to the Alpine German-speaking mission. It's part of Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. So that is perfect for him. He already speaks some German, and so he's super excited about that. He's a big fan of World War II. And so he has loved studying all that kind of stuff. So that's pretty awesome. He's super excited. He has a video of opening his call. It's on Facebook. Shouldn't have told you that. Now everybody's going to leave this meeting and go to Facebook to watch it. Okay, let me see what time it is. Okay, it's just getting after 7 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to remind everybody of the stuff that's going on for this year. We have our upcoming events. Our next big event that's coming up is, of course, every Thursday we have this free class where you can bring your gardening questions and I will answer them. That's what this Thursday evenings is for. But I spend anywhere from 15 minutes to 30 minutes talking about an agricultural subject, a gardening subject, an ecology subject. It's all the same subject, but I talk about that kind of stuff so that we can be really good at growing food. And so that's every Thursday evening, and that's what we're doing right now. The other thing is I am releasing about 5 videos a week on my Patreon page, and that's on here, right here. You can see that on the very top. And so if you need to have access to my library, I have over 300 posts on there, and most of them are me in my garden showing you how to grow food. And so if you need to grow food right now, you could get on there and start watching those videos and it will show you how to grow food. The next big thing coming up is boot camp. That is the last week of April, the 28th through 30th. So that's 3 days. It's a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And that's $500. And this is an absolute wonderful investment. And I'm only charging $500 when I go to classes. The last class I went to was $2,500. The class before that was like $2,200. And I think that my class is better than those ones. So you're certainly getting your money's worth if you sign up and come to boot camp. So you'll be here for 3 days. And will be able to learn how to plant seeds, make potting mix, like a potting soil, make a garden outside, and then we put all the plants in. So you practice planting, transplanting, and harvesting, and we're going to eat food from the greenhouse. And so you will know the whole process of growing fruits and vegetables to be able to go home and grow your own garden. Last year we did it. This year the curriculum is the same. We had people go home last year who have never gardened before, and they had successful gardens. So it's an effective class and it's wonderful. And I encourage you, if you can come, to do that. And then, of course, if you can come here for 17 weeks, if you have that option in your life, usually that would be for like a college-aged person, but anybody could come. And you want to learn to become a farmer, I can train you to go home after that 17 weeks and know all of the skills you need to grow a successful crop so that you can make your living growing food. Obviously, you're not going to learn everything in the 17 weeks, but you will have enough to get started. I will take away the real problems of struggle that people go through when they first try to start a farm. And sometimes it takes them 5 or 6 years to get through all the problems. I can solve that in 17 weeks so that when you get home and start your own little farm business, growing fruits and vegetables for people, you can be successful. And there are a lot of other awesome things happening here at the ranch this year, and they're on this page. Go to my website, www.georgicrevolution.com, and you can find all of the information about that. When you have questions tonight, type those into the chat box. Ezekiel is on here. He is my son. He is a co-host on here tonight, and he will keep track of those questions that you type in, and he will ask those to me, and then I will answer them for you. If we run out of time and we don't get all your questions answered tonight, they will be the first questions we answer next week. All right, so let's get started with our subject tonight. So I'm super excited. I'm thrilled because we're going to be talking about some brilliant things. Let me go to the right slide here. So here's our slide here. We're just going to be talking about this. It's let me adjust my screen a little bit so I can see my slide better. Okay, here we go. So these are the things we want to strive for in our gardens. I put this together almost 20 years ago when I very first started teaching gardening classes, because I noticed that people were all over the place with gardening, and it's really nice to have a framework to be able to deal with if you're trying to grow food, so that you can understand what the goal is. And you could have all kinds of goals for growing food. It could be a million different things, and you do need to know what your purpose and what your goal is. My purpose and my goal is to feed my family, to feed my community, and to train other people to be able to have really good, healthy, quality food to eat. So when we look at these 6 different things, I call them ideals. If you are part of the Lemmy homeschooling groups and you're working with youth, these used to be called the 6 Miniag Ideals, because the idea of taking agriculture and putting it in your yard, you would take the ideas of big agriculture and you would do it in a microscopic way in your backyard, or mini agriculture. But this is the very same thing. It's exactly the same. So those of you who have been exposed to these ideas before from the things I've taught, there are a few things that I've changed a little bit because it's easier to explain it when I'm teaching new groups of people nowadays, but it's the same stuff. So these 6 agricultural ideals to strive for are, this is how I like to organize my mind so that I know I'm going to have food to eat. If there was no more grocery store, I would have food to eat if I had these 6 things in my life. But let's say that in a different way, because there is a grocery store. There probably will be a grocery store for the next 300 years. I don't know. There are problems in the world, and certainly there could be times when we don't have things at the grocery store we expected to have. The year 2020 taught us that, with things not being available. I have a super good friend in Ogden, and he has a pretty big dairy, and he produces a lot of milk. And during those 2020 shutdowns, guess what? He still milked the cows every day. And guess what? The semi truck did not show up to pick up his milk. Guess where his milk went? He dumped it in the irrigation ditch because the system cracked, it broke, and then people at the grocery stores were complaining, saying, we can't get milk, we can't get toilet paper, we can't get, there were dozens of things people couldn't get. So we have learned in modern times that there can be cracks in the system, and there could be a lot of cracks in the system that are way worse than now. So let's figure out the ideal garden with a 365-day harvest. Let's have a garden that feeds us every day of the year. Now, how do we actually do that? Well, there's two ways to do that. The first way is with some type of a climate where food grows all the time. So you live somewhere in the world where you can just grow food all the time. Let's say Hawaii. You could grow food all the time in Hawaii. They do have a rainy season and they do have a sunny season. So the different foods you grow may change a little bit, but there is always fresh food to eat all of the time. So I'm not telling people in North America to move away to a tropical paradise, because we probably live where we live because we want to. So how would we have a garden that produced all year? And that would be with some kind of protection that would create a climate where food grows all year. So that's why I have a greenhouse, because in my greenhouse, I can grow food all year long. All right. So that's the first way. Have a climate that produces food every day of the year. Either you live in a climate or you create a climate with a greenhouse. So that is the first way to have a 365-day harvest. Okay. So the second way to have a 365-day harvest is to grow things during the growing season that you can store when it's not the growing season, and then you can eat what you stored. So let's think about that. You would need some kind of a root cellar or a basement, and then you would need to grow a certain amount of crops that would last you for the entire year. So every day you have something to eat, because obviously it's a bad thing when you grow food for maybe, let's say you're harvesting for maybe, let's say 100 days of the year, and you still have 265 days of the year that you don't have food. That would be a hungry situation, and a desperate situation, and a dependent situation on other people. So, and we will talk about some of the foods you can do that with in a minute. I have another slide to show you those kinds of foods. But we want to have fresh food, we want to have stored foods, and we want to have foods that we can enjoy and love, and things we eat. We don't want to grow a bunch of food that we don't like. So if we are growing lots of, excuse me, if we're eating lots of macaroni and we eat lots of Twinkies and we drink lots of pop, then we need to get seeds for those things and plant those crops so that those are the things we are eating. Obviously, that was supposed to be a joke. So there's one other thing I want to talk about here in this 365-day harvest. And that is the fact that, so everything I've talked about so far makes the assumption that someday there will be a famine and we won't have food to eat. But let me assert something here that I feel pretty strongly about, and that is why I teach these classes. This is why I do 90% of what I do. is because I think there already is a famine in our land. There is a famine of quality food. When we go to the grocery stores and we purchase food, we do not purchase proper nutrition. It is very, very hard to do that. Now, there is a lot of good food at most grocery stores, but there is a lack of super high quality food. And I think people feel this. I think this resonates with most people. I've had very few people argue with me about this in my life. And that's why people tend to believe in food supplements. The multi-level marketing world is full of companies with supplements to help people, because we live in a country that is experiencing a famine of high quality food. And so I'm not teaching these classes to prepare us for an apocalypse that might come someday. I am teaching these classes because you already do not have good access to the highest quality food. So I am teaching you how to grow the best foods possible. And the methods that I'm teaching you will certainly do that. Okay, so that's the end of 365-day harvest. We will come back to it in a few minutes. Okay, intense observation. What does this mean? I used to call this IPDM, which means Integrated Pest and Disease Management, but that means something very specific that is taught in the universities. And when I first started teaching this almost 20 years ago, it made sense to me. In the last 20 years, I've learned a lot more, and it didn't really fit in to these 6 ideals very well, except it did fit in to the IPDM. So intense observation fit in really well to integrated pest and disease management, but I needed to change it because it expanded the definition of IPDM beyond the definition that anybody else is defining IPDM by. So I just changed the name so it wasn't confusing. So this is updated information for the Leadership Mentoring Institute and those who are training the classes, the Georgia classes, which I wrote. This is our updated information for those people so that you don't get confused. So intense observation. And what this means is we are allowing the ecology or the environment to tell us what it needs so that we can have the very best harvest possible. So, what are we going to grow? We're going to grow the things we like. And so we're out there in our gardens and we're growing them. And we think, okay, so we're going to go put our garden in and then we'll go check it next Saturday. And it's been a week and you go check it and things don't look very good. Well, this is not intense observation. We need to be out there every day for 15 minutes observing, looking, trying to figure out things, just watching. The pests will tell us. Pests are a wonderful indicator ecologically of what's happening in our soil, in our plants. Pests will tell us if our plants are absorbing the nutrients properly. Pests will tell us if nature thinks our garden is an ecological disaster. Weeds will do the very same thing. Weeds are an indicator of what is happening. So it's nice to be able to learn to identify what weeds are there. And there's the coolest thing. There's this modern invention. It's called a cell phone. Look at this thing. Everybody has one. If I own one of these, then I think everybody does, because I'm the last person to follow society. But why am I showing you a cell phone? Because there are apps you can get, free apps you can get on the cell phone that will identify pests They will identify weeds. They will identify plants in your area, and they're pretty accurate. You may want to not just point the phone at one plant and then believe what it says. Point it at that same species of plant 4 or 5 times, and if it keeps giving you the same answer, it's probably right. But I have seen those apps give a couple of different answers, so do it 3 or 4 or 5 times. But the technology is really awesome, because then if we know what the plant is, then we can start to understand what the ecology is telling us is wrong with our garden. And so it's really great, you know, because if I go out in the garden and I just doing the basics and I am not intensely observant and I am not watching with laser focus on what's happening, I can lose a lot. I mean, I can lose a lot of information. The garden could be going in a certain direction and I don't even know it until it may be too late. So intense observation is important. But that is how that's how we assess what needs to happen next. If we see the ecology telling us something, if our plants are not absorbing nutrients, we can add nutrients. If the plants are thriving, then we don't need to add nutrients. So intense observation, that is certainly something to strive for. The main thing is get out in the garden, always take a hoe and a bucket with you every single time you walk to the garden. If nothing else, you can sit on the bucket and enjoy nature, but there may be a weed to hoe and there may be something to harvest to take home. So one of my good friends told me that he always takes a hoe and a bucket with him to the garden. And I think that's awesome because it's intentional. Okay, let's move on to number 3, grains. Grains are something that are not popular in the American garden. And this is a shame and it is sad. Grains being integrated into the garden will create a diversity that will bring a different set of wildlife into your garden, different kinds of pollinators, different kinds of insects, which are beneficial. They will bring in different kinds of microbes for the soil that without them you probably won't have in your garden. So integrating grains into your vegetables and fruits is a wonderful thing to do. Grains will help to create a soil sponge so that when it rains, your soil holds the water that comes and your water does not run off, and you keep all of the rain that comes. It's great. You can be watering maybe once a month in the Great Basin desert instead of watering 3 times a week in the summertime. Now, it could take you a couple of years, maybe even up to 5 years to get to that point, but it's certainly something to strive for. This is an ideal that we want. So grains equal civilization. Without grain, we don't have a civilization. And it's a sad thing that most people today don't know how to grow grain. And it's kind of interesting because it's a lot harder to grow most of the vegetables people grow in their gardens and greenhouses than it is to grow grain. Grain's actually pretty simple. Harvesting is a little bit more complicated, and then using it and eating it is more complicated, but the actual growing of the food is extremely simple to grow grain. I think the number one reason to have grain in your gardens is because of the soil building aspects that it will, the benefits it will give to your garden. It's just such a dynamic, beautiful root system that the grains have compared to most of the fruits and vegetables that we grow in our gardens. A rye plant, one single cereal rye plant can have up to 380 miles of roots on it. Most of those roots are microscopic, but imagine that. Because in a patch of, like, I don't know, a garden patch, just a garden bed, 3 feet wide and 10 feet long, you could have hundreds of cereal rye plants in a little patch like that, and it would I mean, how many miles of roots is that in the soil? And what those roots are doing are feeding your microbes. Your microbes are being fed. Your microbes are building the soil structure. Your microbes are mineralizing the sands, silts, and clays so that you never have to put on any kind of man-made fertilizer. So you don't have to worry about any toxicities and residues that come from some of those fertilizers. It's just awesome. Nature just works that way. And so it's pretty great to integrate these grains into our landscape. And then obviously there's many grains that you could be growing on your own land, in your gardens, in your fields and farms. And that helps to create a great amount of nutrition in your own life. So grains are pretty important. Without grains, the whole system collapses because you don't have the same quality of soil. So take grains out of this and you have the other 5. The system is not as good as if you do have the grains in there. All right. And that's actually true of all of these 6 ideals. That's why they're an ideal. We have to have these 6 to make the garden exactly the best it can be. So let's move on to livestock. Livestock is the key to fertility in most of the ecosystems on our planet, especially North America. When we move livestock out of brittle environments, the brittle environment will turn into a desert. And we've seen that happen many times. The greatest ecologists of the world have proven that over and over. And it's pretty awesome because in Arizona, the Navajos had a lot of sheep. They lived on the sheep was their livelihood. They ate the sheep. They would use their wool for their livelihoods, the things that they created, their artwork. And the government came in and said, okay, this is turning into a desert. We need to remove the sheep. And they proved that when you have sheep, they will eat the grass. And the conclusion is it turns into a desert. And so they shot thousands of sheep. Well, their conclusion was wrong. And now the desert is much worse than it was decades ago when that happened. And there are, this isn't the subject for this night's talk, but I'm just pointing out that there are dozens of examples of this happening in history. And we could talk about that more later if somebody wants to. But I'm just pointing out right now that livestock are absolutely the key to fertility in the ecosystem. And so if we don't have a livestock impact in our own food producing systems, we are going to have to supplement what they do from another source, and we can never do it as good as nature does it. And so when we remove livestock, we suffer to have the perfect system. All right. So let's go on to focused gardening. What does focused gardening mean? For those of you in the Leadership Mentoring Institute who teach the Georgic curriculum, this is what I used to call, what did I call it? Intensive gardening. I forgot what I called it. I think it was called intensive gardening. But now I've called it focused gardening because over the couple of decades I've been teaching this, it makes more sense to talk about focusing with laser focus in whatever type of gardening method you choose. Choose a method. There's dozens of them out there that will grow wonderful food. Choose a method, focus on it, make sure that you are incorporating a yes answer to the question of the 4 ecological processes, which we talked about last week. And if whatever you are doing answers yes, it will enhance the water cycle, my nutrient flow, and it will put my ecological succession where I want it and need it. If it answers yes to these ecological processes, then do it and focus on it. If you have a gardening method that hurts one of those ecological processes, you need to be very careful, because you may be destroying your soil and your ability to grow food. And and then you have to grow food in artificial ways, which lowers the quality of the food. And then with low quality gardens, you have lots of pest pressure, lots of weed pressure, lots of work to do, and it takes the fun out of gardening. And then you just want to buy your food from somebody else, which impacts your freedom on what you can get. And then you're being cheated at the grocery store because they only have one variety of tomato instead of the 400 that could be available if you and your community were growing them together. So you're getting cheated on flavors and nutrition from all the wonderful foods that are available if you have to purchase food from somewhere else. So focused gardening is very, very important. Now that takes us to the last one, which is soil. Soil is everything. A functioning soil is 90% of growing good food. 10% is management of growing food, but your 10% management, and let me be clear, your management would be 100, you're managing 100%, right? But if your soil is functioning really good, then it does 90% of the work, and your management is very small. But the management that you actually do, which would be 100%, so it's all you do, it could ruin everything. So our management has the capacity to make gardening simple. It makes it affordable. It makes it beautiful. It makes it tasty. The secondary metabolites in your plants will be bursting with flavor. Your plants will have high sugar contents so that the bugs don't eat them. All of these wonderful things can be happening with your management practices, but your poor management practices can make everything a disaster. All right, but soil is everything. So as we manage, we need to make sure that our soil is creating a successful experience. And so we have to build really good soils. Let me see when my soils class is. I think it's next week. Today is our 6 ideals. Next week is the 5 spheres of the soil. And we will be going into detail for a good half hour about the soil and what a functioning soil is. So soil is everything. Soil is the key to make all of this work. We cannot have a 365-day harvest of nutritious food if we have bad soils. So if we pull out bad soil and we think, what I mean is, if we pull out soil from this chart and then we just have bad soils, we're going to struggle with all of these things. So these are the 6 ideals that we need to strive for in our gardens. And if we strive for each of these, we have a livestock impact, we have a grain impact, we are out there in our gardens intensely observing, we are focused in our gardening method, making sure that it is answering a yes to the 4 ecological processes, and we are focused on the right kinds of plants so that it's creating a harvest that we can eat from every day of the year. Then we're going to be happy people. We're going to be super happy people with what is going on. Let's look at this chart here. So these are the foods that we want to grow if there is a famine in the land. In times of famine, I've got 21 things here that are good to grow. Let's start with the bottom one because I like to break the rules. Cereals grow in the winter time. The letter to the right of these means winter or summertime is when you would be growing and harvesting these. There's some weird ones on here, like garlic, because you plant it in the fall, it stays in the ground all winter, and then you harvest it in the summer. Well, let's just go through these. So cereals, they are something you're going to be growing throughout the winter. Mostly you harvest it in the summer. Lentils are something you grow in the spring, you harvest it in the summer. Berries, they're a perennial, but they're just something that grow, and you harvest them at different times of the year depending on the type of berry that it is. Like strawberries are in the springtime. Your blackberries you'd harvest later in the late summer. Peas are a good one because peas are something that you can eat early in the spring. So that spring and food time is rough because you've already eaten the food from winter time that you stored, but peas come on early, and so you have that early summer crop. Springtime is often the starvation season because you've already eaten all the food, nothing is coming from your garden yet. So peas are an early crop, and you can dry the peas and then eat peas as a dried food throughout the winter time. Peas are fun because you can have a spring harvest and a summer harvest and a fall harvest. If you have a greenhouse, you can harvest almost probably 10 months of the year. You can be eating peas. And that's something I have kind of failed with this in the last year. I need to get going on a good pea rotation so we always have peas to eat. We've had peas, but I haven't had a complete rotation. So that's something for me to work on with my greenhouse. Peppers are good because they can be dried and put into all kinds of soups and stews. They can be rehydrated and go into all kinds of cooking, but they're a good one because they dehydrate very well, and you can store those for years actually in a dehydrated state. Melons are good, and you can get melons that ripen in a cool short season, and you can have melons that store well in a long season, like throughout the winter. There's one called a Christmas melon, because it will store in the root cellar up until Christmas and even past that. Tomatoes are great. Cucumbers, garlic. Why is garlic so good? Garlic is an antibiotic. In a time of famine and a breakdown in the system, garlic is an antibiotic. People who eat lots of garlic seldom get sick. So garlic is a good one for medicinal uses. Cucumbers are good because you can pickle them, and pickles stay good in a jar for years. Tomatoes are good because they dehydrate very well and can be rehydrated to do all kinds of cooking. Obviously, they can be bottled also, salsas, all that kind of stuff. Sweet potatoes are good for warm season, and they store pretty well. In the colder regions, it's harder to grow the sweet potatoes. Kale is good because you can grow it almost 12 months of the year, but it's excellent in the winter and the springtime. Kale is high in proteins and vitamins. If you had nothing to eat but kale for a few months, you would be alive and basically healthy. Carrots are good. They will store for a long time in a root cellar. They can store in the ground in most of North America. If you have wet winters like the Willamette Valley of Oregon, they don't store in the ground as good as other places, but carrots are very good storage. Beets are good, super good nutrition. Onions, spinach. I want to say something about spinach. Spinach is the queen of the winter time. If you can keep the snow off of spinach with any kind of a covering, it will be there for you all winter long to eat. Cabbages are great storage. You can just pull them up by the roots, keep all the big leaves around the cabbage, and then you put the cabbage, just hang it upside down in the root cellar. They last for months. And then, of course, just normal potatoes, and there's many varieties to grow. The potatoes will get you through a winter. Squash, of course, there's the summer squashes you eat fresh, they don't store well, but the winter squashes will last for months and months, and they can get you through springtime if you have a good quality root cellar. Corn is good because you can raise it as a grain. So it stores for a long time, maybe thousands of years as a dried grain. So it will keep you going. Beans, and here I'm talking about dry beans. Dry beans will keep you healthy and happy. And I don't see herbs when I go to the internet and search for things to grow in times of hunger and famine. I never see anybody adding in herbs on their lists. And I think that's nuts, because there are all kinds of herbs which make life very, very happy and healthy when you add up the culinary herbs to give you all kinds of flavors to make all of these other foods just an absolute delight to eat them. You don't think there's a famine when you have awesome flavors. So culinary herbs and medicinal herbs are good. And I put alfalfa on here as an herb because it is easy to grow. Everybody should have some growing in their gardens all the time, because it can feed your microbes in your composts. It's a great mulch to put around your plants. It becomes food for you and your livestock. It has every vitamin known to man. And so if we can't get good vitamin type stuff, eat alfalfa. It's wonderful. The taste takes some getting used to for most people, but it's extremely nutritious. And you can take it and you can pound it into a pulp and then strain the juice through a strainer. You could do that in a blender too, but either way, you get an extract out of that, and you could spray it on your plants as a foliar feed. You could put it in around the plants as a fertilizer to help to feed your plants. So if you grow nothing else on this list for a time of when you want to have super health and nutrition for your family, let's just pick 5 of these. And I haven't thought about this previously, so here we go. I would always have alfalfa. I would always have corn and beans and squash and potatoes. Let me go down the list. Oh, I missed garlic. So what if I could only have 5, I might drop the dried beans and go with garlic. Except beans are pretty important. I don't know. So yeah, I would be hungry to just pick 5, but if I could pick 8, I would probably be pretty happy. Okay, let's move on to the next. I have one last slide here, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So just let's think about this for a minute. One human eats 1,000 pounds of food per year to keep a human healthy. The human, as a biological creature, can be extremely healthy and happy with 1,000 pounds of food a year. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, that's interesting. So I Googled it, and it said Americans eat 2,000 pounds of food per year. Is anybody surprised? Oh, yeah. So I was just thinking, let's just break that down. How much food is that per day? So I just divided 2,000 pounds by 365, and that's 5.5 pounds food per day. So how much food do you want to produce so that you have a 365-day harvest? And then you can just start thinking about all these numbers and come up with some math for your own garden. But let's go back and look at this. Humans erode 20,000 pounds of topsoil every year. So in our agriculture, we need 1,000 pounds of food, but we erode 20,000 pounds of topsoil, and that's a global number. That's not a specific country and their agricultural methods. It's just a global number of 20,000 pounds of topsoil in agricultural practices worldwide. So this is interesting. And it's a disaster. This is a disaster, but anyway, I'm done with that comment, but let's move on. 300 pounds of grain per person is recommended by people who know more about feeding people than me. So there's something to go by. So how much would it take to create 300 pounds of grain? How big does your garden need to be? And we'll answer that in a second. But my one last statement here is, when our soil functions properly, it won't erode. So that 20,000 pounds of topsoil, that means there's a lot of cropland in the world that is not functioning. It's doing something else. It's a non-functioning soil that is producing food. And since it's not functioning, then the food produced on it does not have all of the secondary metabolites it should have, which means it's not as healthy as it could be. So I have one last slide. I lied a minute ago, because this is actually the last slide. So corn will produce 150 bushels an acre. The cereals, that means wheat, oats, rye, barley, triticale, plants like that. Those produce about 50 bushels per acre. Dry beans produce about 25 bushels per acre. It's super hard to get a good number on dry beans because they're so different. Lima beans and white beans and black beans and pinto beans and pink beans. There's 75 different kinds of beans you can go buy, and there's probably over thousands of varieties of those, and they all yield differently. Some of them yield very, very different than this 25 bushels per acre. But if we do the math over here, 1 acre is 43,000 square feet. And if you have a garden plot that's 40 feet by 50 feet, then that's 1/20th of an acre. So I just took corn and did the math from 150 bushels per acre. And on this garden plot that's 2,000 square feet, that, you know, that could be a large garden plot that people have in their yards that live in a town or a city. A lot of people who could have a garden that size. So that's why I came up with this hypothetical here on this slide. But so corn, you could produce 7 bushels of corn. But most people, we don't think in bushels. I do, but most people don't. And so I converted it to pounds for this class. And so that's 392 pounds of corn on that. And what did our slide say, our earlier slide? It said that we need, it's right here, 300 pounds per person per year. So on a garden plot, if we ate corn, if dried corn as a grain was a staple that a family ate, like cornmeal, you're making cereal out of it, like grits or whatever, if that's something that is in your family culture, then this 2,000 square foot garden could produce more than your 300 pounds per person. So if you have 5 people in your family, you're going to need 5 times that, or at least 4 times that to get that. So the cereals, we're looking at 2.5 bushels on that garden plot, and that's 150 pounds. So you need a garden plot that's twice that big. And dry beans, this is 50 pounds. And so you would need more than that. So this is just kind of a breakdown, and this is pretty simple math here. And so you can just look at this, you can take a screenshot of this, or you can watch the recording later or whatever. But this is just kind of a thing you could do, an exercise you could do, a fun exercise with your kids or whatever, to try to figure out how much land you need to incorporate 300 pounds of grain into your life. But remember, it's 300 pounds per person. So depending on how many people are in your family, then that matters. All right, let's go to our Q&A. Ezekiel, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Well, that's good. I was starting to get worried. So good. All right, let's do Q&A. You ask me the questions, I will answer them. For those of you who are on here live tonight, just type your questions into the chat box. I haven't even opened my chat box, so I've not looked at this at all. But Ezekiel is going to read them and I will answer them. And we do this in the order in which they came. If there were any left from last week, he will read those first. I think that's the fair way to do it. If it's not, then you can tell me and we can adjust it, whatever. I don't know. Go ahead, Zeke.
All right, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ezekiel.
Excellent. So there's a couple questions we didn't get to last week. The first of those, so last week we talked about good soil health, and one of our questions was, how do you make your land more infiltratable? How do you increase the amount of water that actually goes into your land when it comes out of the sky?
Okay, so how to make the land more infiltratable. In the world of soil science, we call that creating a soil sponge. A sponge like you would wipe your kitchen counter with. It holds water. When you spill water, a sponge sucks it up. It's kind of like a piece of bread. A piece of bread is like a sponge. It will soak up water. So we want to make the soil into a soil sponge. The way you do that is by adding two things. Number one is organic matter, and number two is organic matter. That sounded like the same thing. But there's two forms of organic matter, all right? The first form is living plants. The second one is the dead plants that have died. And you can get the living plants from a different source from where your land is, or you can grow the plants on the soil, and then when they die, they become the dead plants that become the organic matter. But organic matter is the key to a soil sponge. But that is just the beginning, because the organic matter does not actually create the sponge. The organic matter in the form of living plants and dead plants are food sources for the microbes in the soil. Now, the bacteria and the fungus will create microaggregates and macroaggregates, and that's what makes the sponge effect. So how do you get it in your soil? You grow plants in it and you stop killing the microbes. The number one death of microbes in the soil is tilling the soil. And most people hate it when I say that, because we want to till the soil. We have been tilling the soil for a long, long time. One of my Patreon members called me this week. They called me, and they didn't call me. They messaged me on my Patreon account, and they said, and this was a religious person. I'm a religious person, but they just said, what does it mean in the Bible when it talks about plowing the earth and tilling the soil? Because we hear about that in the scriptures, and I'm confused about what that means, because I actually believe what you're saying, but at least I think they said something along those lines. Maybe they don't believe what I'm saying, but I think they did. And that's the message I got. But I also believe the scriptures, so talk about that, or what am I missing here, or something to that effect. Obviously, I'm not quoting them. But my answer to them was, I don't know completely, but I have been on a quest to try to understand that for a long time, for a couple of years actually. And what I have found is very interesting. One of the first things I did in my research is I went back to the original sources before the word till was translated into English. And in one of the ancient languages, and at this point I have forgotten, but in one of the ancient languages, till meant it meant a tree root. A tiller was a tree root that goes down in the ground. And then in another language where the word was translated into till, that word that was translated, it meant to it meant more like to cultivate, but in the sense of take care of and to nurture. And it referred to things like the way a mother would take care of a baby. They would cuddle, they would love, they would hold, they would, nurture and be aware and give it what it needs and wants. So that is very interesting. So the modern definition of till is different than the ancient texts. So I don't have a complete opinion on this, but I do know what happens to the microbes when we do modern tillage to the soil. It absolutely kills the fungus, and you can kill it quick. One tillage pass can sometimes undo 10 or 15 years of fungal growth, which is a big deal when you understand that when you get 10 inches of rain, you can infiltrate 8 of those inches, and the other 2 inches that run off of your soil are crystal clear, and none of your soil erodes away. So the way that we create the soil to be a sponge and to hold the rain that we get is to grow plants on it and stop killing the microbes. So 2 things to answer this question: grow plants, leave most of the plant biomass there in a dead form after harvest, and don't kill the microbes with pesticides, herbicides, nemicides, fungicides, and all the other sides that kill. Side means to kill, like homicide or suicide. So stop killing the microbes, stop tilling, and start planting and growing crops all the time. Living roots in the soil feed those microbes. So we should have a living root in that soil 12 months of the year. Even if there's 6 feet of snow on the ground, if you're in a climate like that, you still need a living root in the soil. Living roots in the soil feed microbes. The dead plants feed microbes. So that's my answer. Let's go to the next question.
All right. So the next question is, how do you manage land succession areas for how do you manage late succession areas for food growth? Last week, you mentioned that land succession is the most productive in the form of raw calorie production, but that not all of those calories are available for human consumption. Is there a way to manage late succession to be highly valuable for human consumption?
Okay, you're not going to believe this answer. You might want to till it up. Can you believe I said that? Let me put some logic behind that answer before we go to the next question. I'll try to do it short though. If you have the latest succession there is, you're going to have very little bacteria in the soil. You're going to have very little predators eating the bacteria, but you will have a massive amount of fungus in the soil. And so you have too much fungus and not enough of the other microbes you need in the soil, like the protozoa, beneficial nematodes. You may not have as many microarthropods. You'll probably have a lot, but you may not have all the varieties that you would in a more like late to mid, that the beginning of the late succession area. So you would want to maybe cut back on some of the fungal growth. But there is another way to do it. It's more scientific, and you need to hire somebody like me with a laboratory to figure out what you're doing. So if you have a super late succession, you could do some very light tillage and see what happens. But you could really mess it up that way too. So the best thing to do is to hire me or a laboratory like me, and we could pull a soil sample, and then we could see what you need to add. And maybe we could just add in a whole bunch of bacteria to the soil so that the bacteria, so the fungal bacteria ratio becomes more balanced. And that's the thing you would want to do is balance your fungal to bacterial ratio. So let's just leave it at that for now. And whoever's question that was, if you want to talk more about that, we certainly can. So let's move to the next question.
All right, so I've got a couple versions of this one, and somebody actually asked it tonight as well. How do you know how many animals you need per acre? Specifically tonight, someone asked, how many cows would I need to help with soil fertility on 10 to 20 acres?
Okay, I'm going to give you the kindergarten answer, but it's actually a really good answer. It's right. One cow will eat 1 acre of food, and she will fertilize 2 acres of food, of land. Okay, so a cow will eat 1 acre, they will produce enough manure to fertilize 2. In other words, they will fertilize twice as much as they eat. But you've got to realize that if there's no grass growing on your acre, your cow can't eat that acre. And this is where it goes from kindergarten to a more complicated answer. So my question to you is, how much does your acre produce? Will it support a cow? Will it support 5 cows? If you had, let's say you have, let's say you have 2 acres. And on your 2 acres, you have your home, your barn, everything you need, and you are purchasing some hay to feed your milk cow. So you have 1 cow and it's producing manure for you. On that 2 acres, you will produce enough feed to feed a lot of food to the cow, and you will be producing enough food to feed your family. But at the end of the year, that cow will have produced enough manure to make a really high quality compost, because you're going to mix in that compost, the cow manure, and leftover kitchen scraps, and the greenery from your garden that was left over. And you're going to have some other weeds, maybe some tree trimmings, and you'll mix all that up. You'll have a really good compost. And from that compost, you could extract enough compost extract to feed like to inoculate maybe 5 acres, maybe 10 acres. So I know that that's not a simple answer because it's a very complicated question. The problem is I mean, mathematically, I can accurately say nobody has a cow anymore. So the real question is, how many cattle do you have? If you had 10 cows, you could be making a good quality product in a compost extract to, do 20, 30, 40, 50 acres to get that to where it's really producing good. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time. But within 5 years, you should be able to get there. I don't like that answer I gave you. I wish it was simpler than that, but it's not. I need to have a whole class on this probably. Let me write that down right now. I'm going to do a class on this. Go to the next question.
All right. So the next question is, are areas in the final stage of succession immune to desertification?
No. Are areas in final succession immune to desertification? Absolutely not. One forest fire comes through, and if it's a slow burning fire, it could crystallize and glassify, turn that soil into 1/8 of an inch of glass on top, because it melts the sands in there. Usually that doesn't happen, but it could. There could be some real disasters that happen. So no, it's not immune. The redwoods are not immune. The reason the redwoods haven't burned in a forest fire is because the coastal rains keep them wet. So no, there is nowhere on earth that is immune to desertification. Let's move to the next question.
Okay, next question. I've got this from a lot of people. And somebody asked a version of it tonight. What do you recommend for the physical area where you store your food? I've gotten questions about root cellars. I've gotten questions about drying different foods and such. What are your thoughts on what makes that good? Whether, that kind of stuff, a place to keep your food safe.
Okay, I have two answers for that. The first answer and the simplest answer is store it however you know and whatever you like to eat, the method you like to eat. If you're going to go, if you think, oh, the end of the world's coming, I'm buying a freeze dryer and I'm going to freeze dry everything. And so you have cupboards full of freeze dried stuff, but you don't eat freeze dried food and you don't like freeze dried food, you wasted your money and your time. This is not about, let me be clear. This is not about preparing for an apocalypse that may not come to Americans. This is about creating a healthy food so that you can live your best, most prosperous life. That's what food storage is about. Okay, so the second answer is the one you probably really wanted. Oh dear. Yeah, root cellars are awesome. If you don't have one, build one. A root cellar should be, between like 38 and 42 degrees year round. They should be cold. You may not be able to achieve that without some kind of supplemental cooling, but that's okay. If it's just the natural temperature in your climate, it's better than not having one. I love to dehydrate food because we eat dehydrated food. I love to get dehydrated sun-dried tomatoes out and put them in stuff and hydrate them. They make wonderful sauces and soups and stews and side dishes. They're good. And there's 1,000 recipes for sun-dried tomatoes. And if there's not, there should be, because they're awesome. So dehydrating things is good. Dehydrating keeps an amazing amount of nutrition. It's almost as good as eating it just fresh without dehydrating it. Canning and bottling is good, but it goes through a heat process to do that. And so you do lose some nutrition value when you bottle foods. It's a very common thing to bottle fruits like peaches, pears, applesauce, that type of thing. And then preserves that are sugared with, like jams and jellies from fruits. Those are good and popular. They do start losing nutritional values, but they're fun and they're exciting. And if you have a bunch of kids and there is an apocalyptic time, it's good to have some of those sugary things around, not as a staple, but just to keep people's spirits and morale high. So that's a good thing. But root cellaring is a wonderful thing. There's an old book published by the Rodale Press years ago. I'm not sure it was the Rodale Press. I think it was, though, but it was called Root Cellaring. But it was a great book, and they've done more recent reprints. It's a good one, and it's just about all the old time ways of doing it. So my favorite ways are growing it fresh, so you don't have to store it. That's number one. Number two, have a root cellar. Number three, dehydrate. Number four would be bottling. Number five would be freezing. Freezing is really awesome and good too. Anyway, but it takes electricity. Electricity is not safe. I mean, it's safe, but it's not. You can't count on it. The power goes out all the time. All right, that's my answer. Let's move to the next question.
All right. So our next question is, what are your thoughts on foraging and getting food from the wild?
Love it. I love foraging and getting foods from the wild. I think it's the greatest thing. In an apocalyptic time, there won't be a lot left because there's a lot of people who actually know how to do it more than we think. It's interesting. Next time you're in a group of 100 people, have them raise their hand and say, how many of you have ever foraged and go to the wild to eat foods? You will have a couple of people raise their hand, and do the math. If 2 people out of every 100 people assembled in this country know how to forage, if we depend on foraging for a food supply, it's not going to last very long. Those natural resources will be gone soon. I think that it's nutritionally, it's one of the best things, because that food is fresh, it's natural, it only grows in a functioning soil. How many of you have suffered to get berries to grow in your farms and on your ranches? That's because soils aren't functioning. But if you go to the wild and you find berries that are growing, guess what? Those soils are functioning, or those berries wouldn't be there. And where you have a functioning soil, you have healthy food. So I think it's good. I think it's great. What we want to do, and the entire point of the things that I teach, all my classes that people pay for, all of these free classes I'm doing, the entire point of this is to create what we find in nature in our own yard, on the land where we live. So just create those things that we forage for right in our own space. The permaculture world, they always talk about creating food forests. I think it's the neatest thing in the world. Just create one on your own land, then you don't have to forage. You're just always, you can go out there and the food is there. Now, if it's you live in a different climate than things you want to forage for, then it's not going to work, obviously. But there is much more than there's much more we can do than we are doing. All right, let's move forward.
All right. So the next question is, for people in extreme climates, such as subarctic or high alpine areas, are greenhouses, tall tunnels, and similar buildings the only option for family or foods or community scale food production? Or are there uncommon plants and other things like that we could be growing outside?
Boy, I love that question. I love it. I love that question, and I don't know the answer. Well, I kind of know the answer, but I wish I knew more. I wish I could talk about that for a long time because I want to know more about that. But yes, there's wild foods that live in those crazy wild places, and we don't eat them because we don't recognize them as food. This is where our native people are such a wonderful asset to the community. And if you can ever go to like a tribal community and learn about their foods and what they eat and their traditional ways of eating, it's so fantastic and awesome, because if people live somewhere, they had a food source. So think about the Inuits in Alaska. What did they eat? What was their food source? And learn from those people. What did the people in southern Argentina, way down south, what do they eat? What did the people eat in there's that cool place where they grow all the potatoes in Peru. It's like super high elevation, but it's like halfway tropical, and they're growing all these awesome things. It does get cold, but they have long growing season because of the weather patterns, and they grow all these awesome things at super high altitudes. So that's just a fascinating place. So I don't have a good answer for that, and I wish I did. But the way that we would find that answer is to start studying the cultures of the native peoples and what did those people eat. And most of those people were carnivores. They ate a lot of meat. Meat was a big part of their diet. But there were also a lot of other things that people would forage for and eat, and we need to find out and start learning what those things are. And when we find those plants, it would be fun to incorporate them into our own gardens when we live in pretty rough climates. I'm not in the easiest climate right now. We're at 5,800 feet high with an 80-day growing season. And the old timers here shake their heads at me and laugh and smile. I'm talking to 75 plus year old ranchers around here. They smile and they shake their head and they say, it's sure brave of you to try to grow a garden. We've tried to garden all our lives, and we've seen many years that have had a frost every month of the year. We try to grow things, and on the 20th of July, it all gets frozen out. Anyway, it's interesting. So yes, if you want to be guaranteed a crop, build an elaborate greenhouse. All right, Ezekiel, what's the next question?
All right, the next question is, and I've had quite a few of these and one tonight, and I'll read the one from tonight because it pretty much sums up. What advice do you have pertaining to companion planting? I'm working on planning my garden plot and which plants to plant where. Is it bad to plant specific plants of the same family next to each other, or like melons and squashes? And some other people have asked about what are good combinations, or if you think it, you know, if you think that it's something worth even thinking about.
Okay, companion planting is pretty awesome. There's some fun books out there to read. There's more mythology about companion planting than solid science when it comes to the companion planting. Now, solid science is that plants will do much better if you have a diversity of plants growing together. So here's my rule of thumb. I try to have 4 different plant families growing close together so that their root systems will mingle under the ground. So you kind of need to do a little bit of research on your plants, figure out which plants belong to different families. Now we have to, let me just be clear on that. There's the plant kingdom, and then there's there's the order and the phylum and all these different things, but there's the family, okay? And then under family, you have genus, and then you have species. So you can't just have different species or genuses. You have to have 4 different plant families. So that can be hard to do. But if you have a tree growing near your garden, that counts as one plant family because the roots are going to be in that soil. And then if you have say like lettuce growing, and then you have broccoli growing, and then you have say like a solanaceae, like a pepper or a tomato, that would be 4 different families. But even easier is let a few weeds grow. Let a lamb's quarters grow every 6 feet in your garden. Let a random grass plant grow. This is where we talked earlier in our presentation today about grains. Let a corn plant grow just randomly. Let a rye plant or a wheat plant grow randomly, because they are giving you those extra plant families that are going to do something amazing in your garden. And the amazing thing will be, okay, so when you have 4 plant families growing, what happens is there's a symbiotic relationship with the microbes in the ground, and the microbes are going to actually be the ones that turn on secondary metabolites. So they turn on genes in those plants that may not get turned on unless you have 4 plants families growing in there. Okay, so say you had a sterile soil with no microbes, or you have a highly tilled, highly disturbed soil, and you have 5 or 6 or 8 plant families growing, these secondary metabolites may not get turned on. The genes don't get turned on, even though you have the plant families growing. So you have to have a functioning soil, which means your microbes are present and thriving. And then when you plant 4 plant families, those roots will mingle, and by the mingling of the roots of the different completely unrelated plants all the way back to family, then you have then it creates the opportunity where the microbes can turn on those genes so that really cool things happen in your soil. And that's when you start seeing your neighbor's gardens being devoured by pests and they never bothered your garden. You start seeing flavors in your garden that you never knew existed in those species, in those plants before. They tasted so good. You will start seeing colors develop that were brighter, more brilliant, more beautiful. So that's my answer to companion planting. You won't read that in any companion planting gardening book that I've ever seen or read. And a lot of that is because this is new science that I'm talking about. I mean, it's solid science, but it's new science. It hasn't been ingrained into our culture yet. It could be 80 years before this is ingrained into people's culture. Some new science takes generations to become cultural. So Yeah. So should you plant lettuce with garlic? I mean, maybe I do, but not because of the lettuce and the garlic. Should you plant strawberries with garlic? Well, maybe. I mean, I do, but not because of the lettuce or the strawberries and the garlic. It's because I'm trying to get 4 or 5 or 6 plant families growing together so that I can get the microbes doing something to the plants that the plants won't do unless it all works together in synergy. I hope that made sense. That's the end of my answer. Let's go on to the next one.
Next one, had a couple questions about this one tonight. I'll read the one from tonight and then I'll give it a little bit more context. If we put a thick layer of organic material / wood chip stuff on our garden, will we have a bug explosion? One year we put down a thick layer of grass clippings on our garden and we had a big earwig problem. I've had people with similar concerns about adding large quantities of manure or about using things where they just basically put down a whole tree or something because they've read about that. And they're concerned about initial pest outbreaks. What are your thoughts about that?
My thoughts are this. I've heard people say that happens. It's never happened to me, and I don't think I'm a lucky person. I think I have had functioning soils, and so I don't have huge outbreaks of things when I put extra when I do something like that, because nature kind of is self-regulating, and if your soil functions, then the outbreaks don't tend to happen in a way that affects your plants in a negative way. The outbreak could happen let me say that in a different way. The reason an outbreak does happen is because nature is trying to balance something. And so there's something out of balance for that to happen. So, I mean, should you do it? It's always a good idea to cover bare soil. You should never have bare soil. You need to think of the soil like your arm. And would you cut the skin off of your arm? No. The dead organic matter is the skin of the soil. If you see the soil, if you see the sand, silt, and clay particles, and the flesh of the soil, if you're seeing the microbes, the life in the soil, the earthworms, the strands of fungus that you can see in the soil, the white specks that are colonies of billions of bacteria, then you have a problem. You need to have it covered with detritus, which is the top part of the soil. It's that compost layer that I say to put on the soil. So yeah, you need to add that to the soil. If you do have a bug outbreak the first year, nature's just trying to balance. Don't stop. Just keep going. By the way, I've heard people talk about how bad earwigs are and how horrible they are and how they eat all your plants. I hate to say this because it comes out wrong, but I've never had earwig infestations in my gardens where they actually hurt a plant. I see earwigs all the time. That's a good thing. You want earwigs in your garden, but you don't. But if everything is balanced, if your soil functions, earwigs don't eat your plants and destroy them. If they do, that's an indicator that something's wrong in your garden, and you can start working on those things. So the next question will be, well, what's the indicator of a bunch of earwigs eating my plants? It means that your plants were not absorbing nutrients properly, and they didn't have high enough sugar content. The secondary metabolites were not turned on, so you were probably growing the plants in a monocrop. You probably had one row of beets and you didn't have any weeds, and you didn't have anything else, and so they recognized the earwigs as an ecological disaster because monocrops are not natural. So you need to plant a diversity of crops in your garden growing together, and that should balance things. But here again, it may not happen the first year. This could take 1 to 5 years before you get to this point. Okay, let's move on to the next question.
Okay. How can I tell if my soil is fertile where I've never grown anything in it before?
How do you know? How can you tell if your soil's fertile without growing anything in it before? I'm assuming you want to know if it's fertile before you plant something. Well, you can't know that. You don't know that. You're not going to know that without doing a soil test. So send me a soil sample and I will tell you if it's fertile. You could send a soil sample to a university. They will tell you what plant nutrients are available. And that's two different things. Fertility and plant availability are two different things. People think it's the same thing, but it's different. And I don't want to go into that right now. But we can if you want to. But yeah, plant a plant in it and see what happens. If the plant starts growing, it will start telling you if it needs things. If you've never grown in it before and you're in North America, it's not fertile. I can tell you that right now. I mean, it could be, but there's less than 1% chance that it's fertile. But the way to get it fertile within 3 to 5 years is build your compost, get it going, cover that soil right now with 3 to 5 inches of some kind of detritus, wood chips, something, compost, fill it, cover it, start growing plants on it. You have to grow plants on soil to make it fertile. So I already know your soil's not fertile. Of the thousands of soil tests that I've seen in my life, well, I haven't seen them, but that I'm aware of, it's never fertile. Fertility comes from growing plants. So if you were growing plants and then you stopped for 5 years and it was bare ground, then you think, oh, that's fertile soil. No, it isn't, because it hasn't been growing plants. So if you weren't growing plants on it for the last year or 5 years, or it hasn't been growing plants, it's not fertile. Because fertility means that plants are growing on it. That's what the definition of fertility. And the microbes are there. So if you send me a soil sample, I will give you a readout of the living microbes in your soil. Okay, next question.
Okay, next question. Is it worth it to spend time and resources on repairing compacted land with tillage or other message? Or should I just go over and cover it with compost or biological material? Sorry.
I wouldn't, that depends. Are you a market gardener depending on that land to produce you a crop this year to pay your bills? If the answer is yes, I have a completely different answer. So I'm not going to answer that, because this answer is for just home gardeners getting started. Just cover it and plant. Okay, just cover it and plant. If you're planning on paying your bills with it, I guess I better answer this. If you're planning on paying your bills and you need to be guaranteed a crop, send me a soil sample and let's get started on a program, so you can actually be super successful. Okay, next question.
When first pruning a fruit tree right after planting, are we pruning to encourage growth or discourage it? I'm almost thinking to discourage growth because you want root development rather than growth. What do you think?
Okay, you would never do anything to discourage growth, ever. That's called death. It's like a side. We never want to discourage anything. We always are encouraging growth. So let's switch our mental thought process to the fact that resources can never hurt you. You can't be hurt by a resource. One of the problems with politics today is people think, oh, that resource is going to hurt me. It's a backwards way of thinking. So with gardening and growing food, every single thing we do in our management is to encourage proper growth. So what you're going to do is you're going to prune it to encourage proper root growth, which is what you said. I know you said that, but let's not think about discouraging any growth. We wouldn't even want to discourage weed growth, because what we're doing is we're removing a weed to encourage the plant we want to grow. All right. It's just a better way of thinking about it. I think it keeps us out of problems. So yeah, prune the fruit tree. You're going to do two things pruning that fruit tree. Number one, you want to shape it so that it's growing the branches in the right direction. So they're going to become the correct thing in the future. And yes, you do want to prune the top back so that the roots will grow good, but that's going to stimulate really good growth in the right shape for your whatever it is, whatever shape you want. So it depends on the shape you want of how you prune it. So like a peach tree, you're going to prune the top leader out, so it will be a vase shape. An apple tree, you're going to want to leave the central leader and then pick 4 branches on the sides so that you have a uniform round tree. Next question.
Okay, next question. What sort of plants would you recommend in a dry land pasture for rotational grazing with the goal of building healthy soil?
Okay, can you read that again? I'm sorry.
What sort of plants would you recommend in a dry land pasture for rotational grazing with the goal of building healthy soil?
Okay, a diversity of any native plants that will grow in that specific climate. So find out what plants will grow in that climate naturally without doing anything, and then that's what you want to grow. So a dry land could mean a lot of different things. If you're in one of the deserts of North America, find the grasses that will grow in those deserts. A common one that people plant nowadays is the crested wheatgrass. There's different variations of those. There's just the old time one, but there's a bunch of newer ones. Off the top of my head, I can't even think of very many varieties, but there's dozens of those. But what you want a balance of grasses, and forbs and legumes. Forbs are a flowering plant, like dandelions in people's lawns. Everybody's trying to get rid of them. That's one of the worst things you can do, is get rid of dandelions. You may not like the way they look aesthetically in your lawn, and that's fine. If you don't want them, then you don't need to have them. But ecologically speaking, dandelions are a fascinating and wonderful plant to have. They would be classified as a forb. They bloom early, and so they're going to be good feed for your insects. And so when we're thinking about the cattle in a dry land place, you can't just think about the cattle and what the cattle are going to eat. You need to think about the entire ecosystem as a complete whole. When you walk out in the pasture, do you hear birds? Do you hear insects? If not, you have a problem ecologically and your cattle are going to suffer. You need to have the entire ecosystem thriving and beautiful to get it to where those cattle are going to be at 100%. Yeah, a balance of grasses, forbs, and legumes. You want to have 30 or 40 different species growing in that field. So I could give you a list of like 3 or 4 that commonly grow around, but you need to do research and find the plants that will grow in your area. Yeah, so I didn't answer your question very good, but it's more important to know that you need that wide diversity than for me to tell you 3 or 4 different plants that would grow in a dry land area. So yeah, we have entire courses on that. If you came to the Alan Savory educational events here on the ranch this year, that is what we talk about. Go ahead, and next question.
All right. The next question is back to fruit trees. If a tree gets too tall, then doesn't the fruit become gross because it's too much for the tree?
I didn't understand. Did you say gross? Growth?
Yep. Gross, as in doesn't taste good. If a tree gets too tall, then doesn't the fruit stop tasting good because it's too much for the tree?
No. Maybe. I've never heard of that. It kind of seems logical that if the tree got too big, then they wouldn't create enough sugar to, that's a good thought to think about. I'll think about that. Thanks for that. I'll think about that. I don't know. Any fruit trees that I've ever managed, we always kept them pruned and thinned them, so they always tasted good. I think they would still, because see, when they create sugar, that's just a matter of, that's just metabolites happening. So as long as your soil was functioning, the metabolites would happen, and then it would just be time. The reason fruit is I'll use your word, gross in the grocery stores, they pick it before it's ripe. I think fruit would ripen whether it was pruned or not, and it would still sugar up, because that's just a physiological, that's just a process that the plant grows through during the growing season, and then once it ripens, it falls off the tree. So the reason fruit wouldn't taste good, I don't think would have anything to do with pruning. It would be small if it didn't, if you didn't thin it properly. It may not get as big. People like to buy fruit that looks good, tastes good, and has, and is big. They want it big. So in the industry, we thin the fruit to make it big, and then it creates sugar on its own. I think if you had a tree and it got to the end of the year and they just never produced sugar, there's some kind of a disease in the tree and the metabolites are turned off. If you're weeding around your trees and keeping bare soil, you may have fruit that doesn't sugar up. You need 10 or 15 different, a minimum of 10 or 15 different plants growing under your fruit tree, so that the microbes can turn on the secondary metabolites in the tree. So yeah, let's go to the next question.
Okay. Next question is, okay, so this is a question about biodynamics, it looks like. Certain days of the lunar month are days to prune, to encourage growth, or to discourage growth. When planting with the moon, the thing to do then is to just prune the fruit tree on those days to encourage the growth. Yes?
Yes, the best publication on this that I've found is Maria Thune. So Maria Thune, I think it's Thun, Thune. I think she has passed away now, but her work still gets published every year by somebody. It might be the biodynamic people. Somebody publishes it though. You can buy a Maria Thune calendar, and she's right. If you are strict and you follow that moon calendar that they put out, that the biodynamic people put out, you will see a difference in the garden that you manage with by the moon signs than if you manage differently. It's not a huge difference, but there are differences, and it works. It's pretty good. It's pretty solid science as far as, folklore science. It's good. There's a lot about it we don't know. When you're following the biodynamic methods of Rudolf Steiner, you have to actually do what he said and not just do what people said he said. That's where people get into problems. Well, I did all this stuff and it didn't work. No, you didn't. You did what you thought you heard somebody say, and they didn't even say it right. So you have to actually learn how to do it and then do it. But yes, I plant every month of the year in my greenhouse for the crops to replace the things in the garden. And I plant my crop, everything 3 days before the full moon because it's beneficial. So, but I didn't actually, I probably didn't answer your question exact about the pruning thing, because I don't know. I would have to just go look it up. So just look it up from a reliable source, and then there's your answer. I can't answer that specifically. Next question.
All right. So the next one is, can you tell us more about secondary microbes? I'm interested in what they are and what is their role compared to fungi and bacteria.
Secondary microbes, is that what you said?
Yes, so I believe it's about microarthropoda, nematodes, that kind of stuff.
So in this, tonight I've been talking about secondary metabolites. Those are not microbes. A metabolite means like when people or plants metabolize something, it's the metabolic process that we go, that our cells do to carry on the functions of life. And there's certain genes within plants and animals that are turned on and off by something besides the plant or animal. And in people, it's the microbes in our bodies that turn on genes and turn off genes that make us healthy or unhealthy. Most of, or at least a lot, I don't know about most, but I think it's most, but I don't know, because it's an emerging science and we learn new things every week. It depends which webinars we're on. But like viruses are responsible for turning on most of the genes that don't get turned on, that are causing the, what are they called? The common diseases. What is diabetes? It's a certain kind of disease.
Autoimmune?
Yeah, thank you. It's an autoimmune disease. So there's all these autoimmune diseases that we're plagued with, and we've been plagued with them. The curve is huge. The S curve there, on the graph, it's huge since the invent of some of the modern herbicides. It's killing the microbes in the soil, so we're not eating the microbes in the food anymore. And so now the genes are not getting turned on because the microbes aren't there to turn them on in our bodies. So hopefully this is what you're asking, was about the metabolites, but secondary metabolites. So there's the normal metabolites that plants have, all right? And the normal metabolites are things that make a plant look good. So I can grow a head of lettuce and it looks exactly like another head of lettuce I grow. So I'm growing 2 heads of lettuce. One head of lettuce I grow, and I grow it in a sterile soil, and I feed it an artificial fertilizer like Miracle-Gro. And the other head of lettuce, I grow it in a functioning soil, and one head of lettuce will look exactly like the other. But then when you taste the lettuce, they have a totally different flavor. And when you do a nutritional test on the lettuce, the one in functioning soil will have super high sugars. It won't have pests. It won't have disease. The other one could be susceptible to pests and disease if they came along. And the reason is because the secondary metabolites were turned on by the microbes in the soil, in the functioning soil, and the secondary metabolites made that healthy head of lettuce. It made it taste better. It could have made the colors better, so it might even look different, but sometimes they don't look different. It makes it so the diseases don't kill it. It makes it so that the nutritional levels are super high. It's full of all kinds of vitamins that the other one wasn't. So metabolites, secondary metabolites. Yeah, that's a new thing. It's a new scientific breakthrough to understand secondary metabolites. I don't know if they're still, I don't know if they are teaching this stuff yet in college curriculums. If they're not, that's a terrible thing. They need to, but sometimes the science that's taught in some universities is kind of late getting there. I mean, we understand that with computers. By the time you buy a computer, it's obsolete. By the time you buy a cell phone, it's obsolete. We understand that with technology. Well, it happens with science too. I mean, look at people like Galileo and some of the old time scientists. They were burned at the stake. They were, you know, because the science is not up to date. So where did I learn it? Well, I'm on the computer for an average of 2 hours a day. This last winter, it's been 4 or 5 hours a day on the most modern webinars, watching the breakthrough in all the sciences. So, you know, I hope that answered your question. If it wasn't, ask it again. Zeke, let's go to the next one.
Well, that's all the ones that I have recorded.
Oh, okay, good. We made it through all the questions. Good. I hate to leave questions for next week from somebody who asked it this week, because that feels like I didn't answer the question. So that's good. So that is the end of this session. Next week, I made a list. I'll announce right now what our next week is about. Next week is the 5 spheres found within the soil. So this is going to be talking about soil function and what we look for when we take a shovel out and we dig in the soil and we look at the soil so that we can understand if it's functioning or not. Somebody actually asked that question tonight. How do I know? Well, next week is going to be about that. So we're going to talk about the 5 spheres within the soil. I already have slides of pictures of the soil. I might add in some more pictures this week, but we're going to talk about that in detail. And yeah. So come with your questions, share this with your friends and family, share the recordings. They are on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. And if you need to grow food right now for a business to sell food, if you have a need to grow food for your own family, sign up for my classes and tell all your friends and family. And if you just need to do it at your own house, my online classes are $8 a month. Thank you for being here tonight. And I will see if I can figure out how to turn this off. I got it. Thank you
Okay,
for helping
awesome.
me, Ezekiel. Good night.
No problem. Have a great night, Pa.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.